All right, as promised, the continued conversation around the rookie class for the Brooklyn Nets and what they can do going forward to help the Nets win a championship today. Kessler Edwards, the mighty 3-and-D wing, and how crucial he can be going forward. We'll break that down. Maybe a little David Duke Jr., a couple other names as well, as we see if the Nets can shift the tides in a youth movement. All coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right, friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Makowitz, all off season long. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and let you know, we'd also like to thank today's sponsor of the Locked On Nets podcast. That's going to be Sakara Nutrition. Sakara is a wellness company anchored in food and medicine on a mission to nourish. Go to sakara.com/lockedon20 or enter code lockedon20 for 20% off at checkout. Doug, it's the Locked On Nets podcast finally, where we talked about Cam Thomas. We broke it down into a fine powder. Doug thinks that he should be benched. I'm kidding. We all know that we're a fan of him. Could take time to develop. Now, though, arguably a more impressive rookie because of where he was drafted, Kessler Edwards, and what he can mean for this team.
Yeah, the Kessler Edwards situation is so interesting, right? Because, there was some I think at the time when he was drafted, most people agreed that like the Nets, or they had something that like could happen, right? Like he had some of the attributes of what you would want from a guy that you were going to take a stab on, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's long, he's like, I wouldn't call him athletic, but he had like some strength. He hadn't shown tons and tons at the college level, but in the current NBA, there's a world where this guy can actually like really, really translate to real NBA skills, but it might take time. And then all of a sudden, kind of COVID rears its ugly head again in the middle of December, and now he's coming in. Guess how many minutes he played in his third NBA game?
34.
44. He played 44 minutes in his third NBA game. If you remember, like this is the part of the season where everything's gone off the rails and like they're just signing like literally anybody off the street. And now a guy who's picked 44th in the draft, who had barely played in the NBA, played 9 and 3 minutes the games before that, is playing 44 minutes. And by the way, kind of looked decent, like 17 and 10. And all of a sudden you're thinking, man, the Nets really have something with this guy. And this isn't like, we'll get into our Kessler Edwards, breakdown here in a second, but just taking one step back and thinking about this season, the guy's a second round draft pick. Okay, we'll see. We'll stash him in the G League for a couple years and see what happens. Nope. COVID, no one's around, no players, 44 minutes, go out and play, kid. Looked good enough. And then we saw how the rest of the season worked out. So it's just a funny to remember sort of how this started, because I think everyone got used to having Kessler Edwards where he becomes a starter and he, has real meaningful minutes for the Nets. That wasn't anywhere close to the plan. This was the true, we have nobody. You're on a 2-way. You need to come play all the minutes or we're just going to forfeit the game. Like that's where the Nets were at that point in the season.
And it is, we talked about Cam Thomas and the perspective and the approach that the Nets were taking coming into this year, like you always do, superstars and then fill it out with veterans. So to your point, like I don't know what the timeline was supposed to look like, but it was, hey, Kessler, let's develop you. And he ended up arguably, we talked about Cam Thomas, but Kessler Edwards was the most consistent contributor, right? And the one that needed to be relied on to actually do some significant work for the Brooklyn Nets over the course of the season. When we get inside of his game, I think you said it, right? There's something we mentioned about Cam Thomas as well. NBA ready body. That's what Kessler Edwards came in with, right? There was one point where you saw him out there next to Nick Claxton. You thought, gee, I don't know if he should look bigger than Nicholas Claxton, an indictment on one side of the line or the other, but an NBA ready body. Obviously had the versatility defensively. I think he took those growing pains. He had those lumps, but he's the classic mold of a 3-and-D wing that exponentially. The one thing I'll ask you is, even though you say, hey, let's develop this kid, But when you do rewind back to the start of the year, regardless of what the plan was for Brooklyn, they didn't have a 3-and-D guy on the roster, right? I mean, Kessler Edwards effectively was the only guy that had this skill set for them. And you saw this was like the tantalizing sample of what it could look like if you add another player like this into the mix here. And I thought that Kessler, again, played incredibly consistent, hit a bit of a rookie wall along the way, but overall had to be elated with what you saw from him very early. Came in very professional, polished kind of player, I feel like, from an attitude standpoint.
Yeah, he only ended up playing 7 total games for Long Island this year. Like he was, he came up and they just basically used him. And you hit the nail on the head. For his future for the Nets, and the reason he played so much this year is because he fit an archetype that they just simply didn't have. Like they just didn't have a 3-and-D wing. I still almost hesitate to totally put him there because like he has. I think he has like the game that can mature into that. And he did enough of it, but it wasn't totally consistent. It's fine. He's 21 years old. He was a 2nd-round draft pick and you got way more than you ever thought you were going to out of him. But yeah, no, in terms of like why he played, that is the why. Like you said, the why is because at some point they needed like someone basically 6'7" or above that wasn't a beanpole to be out that could shoot, that could walk down into the corners and you wouldn't like, throw up having to pass it to him if he was wide open in the corner. Like that is what he ended up becoming. And, he showed some flashes on defense as well, but it was really more the story, and kudos to him. Sometimes it's right place, right time for these guys, right? Like, that's, you have to be lucky. You got to be good and you have to be ready for the opportunity, but sometimes you just need to be lucky. And his luck part of this was he happened to be the only dude, like sort of in the whole organization that fit the bill around this like one guy who, by the way, every team needs lots of kind of
right. Right? The moment of irony of being like, and by the way, the fact that there was only one of these could certainly be a big picture indictment on the organization.
Totally. Well, it's like, well, Paul Millsap's not that, so that didn't work, and then you just go right on down the line of all these like sort of hybridy dudes that you thought was good, that you thought were going to work for one way or the other. So anyway, kudos to him for being ready for it. I thought he more than lived up to it. Like he way exceeded expectations. We'll get into parts of his game we liked and we didn't, but I just think from a high level, I kind of just wanted to take a second and just remember that this A, wasn't the plan. B, at the end of the season, he actually forced them into a very tough, because he did so well. He forced them into a very tough choice about letting a veteran going into the playoffs because they needed to convert his 2-way contract into a real contract and like make him a full-time NBA player, which is what they did. Now, one other just like housekeeping thing, and then we'll really get in. Sorry, I cut you off, but he is currently like as we're recording this, not 100% a net. Like they have to pick up the team option that they have on him for 1.5. They're almost definitely going to do it. It would look bananas crazy if they didn't, because they like cut somebody to keep him on the roster at the end of the year. So they kind of just have to do it. But I will say there is a world where he is not for sure on the same contract next year because they have to guarantee the team option, but I think they're going to.
Yeah, it's funny, forcing their hand like in the best possible way, right?
Yes.
At the end of the year, wanting to reward someone who showed up for you when you needed them. Like this is one of those times when it felt good that you released James Johnson, regardless of anyone's opinion on him and what he was doing for the team, right? It felt good because it gives you this sense that the outlook for this player in Kessler Edwards is certainly someone that can be a part of this team, which we'll get into here in a minute, because I'm gonna follow up with an interesting stat line that gives you pause around why are we so excited about Kessler Edwards. Before we do, though, we'll tell you about our friends over at Truebill. That's because Truebill is, of course, that new app that helps you identify and stop paying for the subscriptions you don't need, want, or simply forgot about. I know a guy, I'm not going to say his first name is Doug and his last name is Nori, but he may have been paying for a TV-based subscription service for many more months than he actually realized.
By the way, two are the same one at the same time.
And that's what they call a classic double down. And that's why Truebill is here to help you out, because they're going to go ahead and get you off of those subscriptions, save you money, and the Truebill concierge will even negotiate some better deals on the current subscriptions that you want to keep. It really is, we know, saving people on average $720 a year with Truebill. Companies make it hard to cancel. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. That's why Truebill is here for you. You can go ahead and not fall for those subscription scams, excuse me, and start canceling today at truebill.com/lockedonnba. Do it right now, my friends. Truebill.com/lockedonnba. It could save you thousands a year.
And when you're done with that, go and grab yourself a Built Bar. We got the re-up from Built Bar the other day. They sent a box of the birthday cake puffs. And I said this on a previous podcast, but I'll reiterate it here because it was true. My daughter wanted to do the read. She insists always on coming on the podcast to just say, she wants to say anything. But for this one, she actually wanted to do the Built Bar read, because she got into the birthday cake puffs and she was all in, 100% covered in white chocolate. They got the sprinkles on it, so makes you think you're eating the birthday cake, but then you look at the stats and you know that you're actually getting something healthy for you. 150 calories, 16 grams of protein, only 9 grams of sugar, which you're actually not even going to believe once you take a bite into these. You'll be convinced you're biting into a candy bar, but you'll know from the old guilt factor piece that you are not. You are getting something healthy, the best protein bar on the market. That was what Built Bar has done. They did it with their puffs as well. You go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off of your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com.
And of course, as you know, just real quick here as we get back into the conversation around Kessler Edwards, we're a family-based podcast. Doug and I are essentially that. I spent some time with your lovely daughter the other day, and it was, quite frankly, it was a joy. It was a pleasure.
Babysit, if you will. She's not a baby, but
by my standards, as a man with no children, it was like babysitting. And what just a true classy lady she was. That's how you know I'm used to that verbiage. Anyway, bottom line is we talk about Kessler Edwards. I think this is really funny to contextualize it this way. 5.9 points per game, 3.6 rebounds, half an assist.
There you go.
That's his stat line average for the season, right? And yet this is like the classic sports term, the old eye test, right? What you saw him capable of doing on the court. And I think this is specifically defensively is what gets you excited about him. And I'll ask you, because I think the 3-point shooting, that's going to actually, he had rough runs there where he had a little bit of struggle, 35% effective field goal percentage from beyond the arc overall, which is good. And he can build on that. But when we think about what this looks like, why he's important going forward, like he's not just because he's 3-and-D, he actually fits in what we project to be the new iteration of this team. When you think about Ben Simmons being added in there, I mean, start on both ends of it, the defensive component, and then obviously how they can utilize him beyond that.
Okay, so Kessler fits into the rest of our discussions. Go back and listen to our previous, the rest of this week's podcast. And the theme that we brought up yesterday was that whenever we list a guy, we then have to immediately list all the guys they can't play with. Like that was
yes.
that was the theme of yesterday's podcast and the one before. It's like insert player X that that's need to make a decision about, and then explain why that player doesn't fit with player Y and Z, and like why it's all so problematic. Kessler is actually a guy that you don't do that for, because this kind of player every team needs. You don't worry about the stat lines for him. By the way, that was on 21 minutes a game, the 6 points, 3.6, and, less than an assist a game. Who cares? You don't want him to do. You just don't want him to do anything else. That is not what you're asking him to come to your team to do. And this is why, actually, of all the players, he's maybe like the easiest decision, because 1, he's still young. 2, you hope he still continues to mature into a game that translates at the NBA level. Is it going to be like a $12 million a year player? No, of course not. But is there a world where a guy that can play defense and hit some corner threes and be able to switch basically 2 through 4 at worst, can hang around the league for a long time? For sure. And again, it just goes back to what we said before, is that he was just one of the only guys that did this. This is why he ended up playing. So this is actually where the stats, you don't care. Don't do anything. Have it all be zeros, basically. It doesn't really matter. I mean, not zeros. You need something, you need some points, but you don't worry about any of their counting stats, because the league is filled with teams that need these guys. They will overpay for them. I can give you the entire list. Guys whose stat lines will not match up with their points, what they do per minute. A lot of these guys are just getting out of series. Dorian Finney-Smith, Mikal Bridges, Jay Crowder. Jay Crowder's different, but these guys can have long careers / get paid a lot, because they do a specific thing that especially teams that have offensive centric superstars like a Kyrie and KD, you just need these guys. And the hope is that he just keeps getting better, because goes back to yesterday's, at some point you need to develop guys that can play real minutes for you that don't cost a lot. Yep. He actually, of all of them, has the best chance to do that.
Yeah, and you can project forward as some other numbers come off behind the superstars, then you can start to pay him. Not massive money, but you can still start to increase what you're giving him as other contracts come off. The funny thing is too, the first thing is when you think about what his skill set is, and then you even combine it with some of these guys that we've talked about over the course of this offseason, two players with ankle injuries like Joe Harris and Seth Curry. When you have a couple of those guys, a couple of those pure shooters on the roster, all of a sudden Kessler Edwards' value, even offensively, increases a little bit more. The defensive piece is great. Hey, keep switching, right? Get Joe Harris off of the harder defensive assignment. Get Seth Curry off of the mismatch where he is undersized to try to take on a particular assignment, and put Kessler Edwards, who, by the way, is always just a funny footnote. I just learned this the other day. If you stretch your arms out completely to the sides of your body and measure that, that's what your height is. Like your total width from tip to tip of your fingers is what your
not
height
if you're an NBA,
to.
not if you're an NBA player. It's not
exactly.
It's about 5 inch. I had a long extended conversation explaining this to my wife, like this year, and she was floored by this revelation that your arms can be longer. I was like, this is why these guys are great, because he stands 6'7", but his arms are 7'2" or whatever. I don't know what Kesslers are, but like, sorry to cut you off, but my wife was like, she refused to believe it. I had to like go into like the draft stuff to show her what these guys' wingspans were. Sorry.
No, and by the way, because I talked about it in football, we talked about cornerbacks. We were saying about, well, he's only 5'10". Yeah, but his wingspan is the equivalent of a cornerback that's 6'3". That's why he can still cover in spite of being undersized. It's the same thing for Kessler Edwards, who is 6'8", they list him at, with a wingspan of almost 7 feet, right? So he's getting that much more. And that's why the upside value is there as well. The other piece of it, I think, we talk about his offensive game, is that something we've talked about with Cam Thomas too. What were the little things you were starting to see as the season progressed and he got more games underneath his belt? With Kessler, I like to think he's methodical, which is a good thing. He sometimes feels like he's a little bit slow, right? Like in terms of his pacing and how he looks offensively, some of the decision making can be a little bit mechanical on an end. But towards the back half of the season in his usage, I thought what you started to see that you didn't see early was his ability to drive the lane. And it was one of the first times we had referenced this player for the Brooklyn Nets because of what he had been. And you talk about players in the league that can have long careers. Well, Jeff Green has had a long career. He's never made a ton of money. I think he maybe hit one big contract. He's played on a ton of teams and always had this value. He's more athletic than Kessler Edwards is. He does different things. It's not like for like, but Jeff Green, even at his advanced age now, can still do this thing where he can blow past someone and get at the rim. That's the piece that I think if Kessler can do a little bit of that, he started to get into a little bit of the mid-range game, right? Inside the arc. This is that thing of now show you can do the second part of scoring offensively, and now you increase your threat and you increase your value for this team. Do you see that the same way as he's limited? I can't just put the ceiling at infinity for all of these players, but I think there's still something untapped there offensively that Kessler can develop.
Real quick, how much do you think Jeff Green made in his career? Total career earnings?
34 million.
You are off by almost 2/3, 86 million. He's been around.
Yeah, but
forever.
what was the big contract?
Yeah, he had a 15 million. He got like a 15
right?
million now from the Magic.
There was one in there.
So
guess what, Kessler? You can still make a couple of bucks.
I'm screwing around for you. He's been around forever. Anyway,
yeah.
I think so. A couple things, right? So, and Jeff Green's so funny because he's like been like the poster boy for people thinking it was gonna be something different. And then good job on him, turn himself into something later in his career.
Right.
Well, a couple of things on Kessler. I agree with you on. I think the part where he put the ball on the deck a little bit more later was just him getting more comfortable with the speed of the game. Oftentimes with guys like this, it takes a while to come because he was not asked to do that really at any point in his career. And like the speed of that makes it a very dicey proposition for you to put the ball. Basically just start dribbling around these NBA defenders because it can turn out so bad. And I get why these guys are hesitant. They probably should. He's making the right decision by not dribbling, right? Like, so you don't want to do that. I think part of the reason he looks slow is because he's a very stiff player. Like he's kind of upright and he's just not a fluid athlete. Like around, like there's no fluidity to his game at all. It's very, like
you know, the one spot I'll push back. Here's the one spot because I was only thinking about adding something to the other end of the floor for him. The one spot where he looks incredibly fluid is on like recovery blocks, right? Like weak side help.
Yeah,
he has that athleticism to like block while controlling his body. But you can take.
For sure. It mostly looks athletic when he doesn't have the ball. It looks completely unathletic when he has the ball, which again is fine. Like if you can develop the part where he can keep people honest. Like he shot 44% from the left corner. You'll take that all day long. That was on like enough attempts. I think like 46 attempts or something like that. Like you'll take that pretty much all day in terms of like what he can do. 39 attempts, sorry. Worse from the right corner, 6 for 24, but that's okay. That might, some of this could be, I'll just take those, even them out, and make them like something like a high 30s from the corner, and you can start living with like what those outcomes are. If you can do that, if you can trust that in an emergency he can dribble the ball a little bit, and with some more maturity around schemes that he'll just get better defensively. Yeah, there's a lot to like here. Like, and again, you mentioned Green, like not a comp, but the archetypal, like we'll just call these guys 3-and-D guys. Like, this is where you can keep them around, right? I think there's I think it's very easy to see a world where he stays around. Now, the better question I guess we can talk about next is like sort of along the Cam Thomas line is, what do you want to see happen here this year? Because I think we can guarantee, again, they haven't picked up the team option. I think we can close to guarantee he's on the team. The next question is, what is the expectation that you'd feel good about in terms of his minutes and what you can live with on the downside? Because that is not always going to be perfect, because these are the operating questions for a lot of these guys.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Coming up here in a second, I'll make the case why Kessler Edwards should be a key contributor for this team in the upcoming season, nay, maybe even in the starting rotation. But before we get to that, let's tell you about our friends over at Sakara. That's because if you're looking and trying to feel your best, it also shouldn't mean deprivation. Instead, it should be about joy and a little bit of abundance. Sakara's organic, plant-rich, transformational nutritional program are designed to help you cultivate body intelligence so you can nourish your body and experience the results that you want. Sakara is a wellness company anchored in food and medicine on a mission to nourish your body through the power of plants. That is because Sakara is functional, plant-rich wellness essentials, helps you create a body that you're loving and living in, makes you feel fit, gives you the energy boost, gives you all of the components of a healthy, well-balanced diet that's going to help you not only with a boost in energy, but support your digestion, curb your sugar cravings, and get your skin glowing. I know I could use a little bit of that complexion, rocking it on YouTube. And right now, Sakara is offering our listeners 20% off their first order when they go to sakara.com/LockedOn20 or enter code LockedOn20 at checkout. That's Sakara, SAKARA.com/LockedOn20 to get 20% off of your first order. Sakara.com/LockedOn20. Now, in the land before time, when the Nets hadn't acquired Ben Simmons, I think I would have said going into next year, Kessler Edwards should be plugged into a starting role, specifically because what do you need? Defense. That's what Kessler does, and he has the three-point shooting. So he really fit in there quite nicely for them. Does the addition of Ben Simmons change the equation of how you construct the starting rotation and the bench unit when you look at this team? Because now you can say, well, and by the way, we've talked about previously the center discussion we had earlier in the week. We already have Nicholas Claxton. If you're bringing back Drummond, what is Day'Ron Sharpe's role? You only need to, at a given time, have so many balancing defensive versatile weapons. So, and when we had that debate, can Kessler Edwards play with either Nick Claxton or with Ben Simmons? Yes, he can. And maybe that's his versatility piece as a complementary player that you don't have to worry about. Well, what are we losing now in this 5-man rotation?
Yeah, so assuming everything goes correctly here with injuries and surgeries and all that stuff, he's definitely not a starter. So I don't think that's in the cards. I think you're looking at something like Kyrie, KD, Simmons, Joe Harris, and insert big, unless you really want to get weird and you go really small. But I don't think they'll want to do that. I think they'll go more traditional to start the year, and like Seth Curry's in there, like off the bench or something like that. In the current roster construction, and you just live with like the non-spacing among the two bigs, knowing that you'll be huge, right? So I think in that way, I think you're okay with that. I don't think he fits into the starting lineup. I think actually if he was starting, it would probably mean something else went wrong. Like, I think there's just too much talent in one way or the other. Like, Drummond, he's a bad example. Like Joe, he wouldn't start over Joe Harris, let's say, right? Like, and I don't even think there'd be a world where he'd start over Seth if like Joe Harris couldn't play or something. They just, because those other guys are elite at doing something else. Kessler Edwards is not elite at anything. He's serviceable at a couple of things, and it was sort of nice to have. But in terms of him like having a real role in the team, he's another example, like we said with Cam, that has to get minutes. He has to play. Like, he has to have some sort of like not a starting role, but some sort of early season 10-man rotation, getting minutes, getting reps, getting comfortable. like that will pay huge dividends later. And luckily for him, unlike the other guys that we mentioned, he has way fewer problems of slotting in against a couple of these other weird guys because at least he can kind of space the court.
Yeah.
Like that's really the problem with all these other guys. They can't really space the court. Like a lot of these, the Nets had too many non-spacers and they can't play you can't play non-spacers together. Kessler's like you can play him with a bunch of different guys. So there's really no reason for him early in the season to not be playing minutes. I get why he didn't play like sort of near the end of the playoffs and like whatever, but the series just wasn't going to work out. But like this 14 to 16 minutes, if everything else is still healthy on the team, that has to be kind of in the cards for him. And if it's not, I would, even more than Cam Thomas, I would really question is like, what's the plan here? Like if because Cam, I can make more of a case for. It's like, hey, you're running up against a bunch of other sort of guards and you don't really fit in and you're not a distributor and we don't need more scoring really at that point among the guard position. But the Kessler, like I would question, I think a little bit about the plan if he was buried early, because I would worry that unless they got somehow pull up some other 3-and-D guy, but if they don't, like he has to be playing in some form or fashion.
Yeah, I just can't. I can't see balancing again from the sample size that you got. Now, it's an imperfect science because if both Joe Harris and Seth Curry are on this roster, that makes things look differently offensively and the waves that you can throw at teams. So, but there were plenty of games over the course of this season, whatever iteration of the roster it was, where no lead was safe for Brooklyn. Right? They were very capable of being up 20 plus points, and every NBA team is. But they were capable of saying, "Well, here's the problem: we're undersized. We don't have any defensive players. And even the ones that we do have can get caught in really bad mismatches. And all of a sudden, we can't protect the lead." So this balancing act, I think, it's your point of where does he fit? Well, get out there, whatever the starting rotation is. You said Joe Harris back in there healthy. Get out there and get a lead. And then sick Kessler Edwards on one of their better players, get him in those switches defensively, frustrate them when you're getting some of your starters rest. And then the beauty bonus part is he can actually, and then he can give you the upside offensively, right? If all of a sudden he knocks down a triple over his 4 or 5, 6 minute run that he goes in on, that's the bonus. And by the end of the game, he can be sitting there 8 to 11 points. And more specifically, having done all of the things that sometimes don't get into the stats. Where did you show up defensively? And then even the steals, the blocks, etc. But I think he's going to have, like we said, the unimpressive stat line at the top of the show. I don't think that his stat line is going to be lights out impressive next year. But if you watch the team game in, game out, you'll see where he shows up and how important he can be for them. So yeah, I'm wholly on board with you too. It needs to be consistent. We said it about Cam, and maybe you're right. He could get buried behind some other talented offensive weapons. Kessler Edwards needs to have a consistent role. Every single game, he needs to expect X, however big or small it is. That's what you're doing. Game in, game out. We're not messing around and trying to massage something. They should be able to have reliability in that because all these guys are giving you samples now.
Yeah, I wish I had more trust around this process because there's been too many examples of where it just didn't happen. I'll even go like when things were okay. It's like, hey, Millsap's kind of playing. No, he's not. Bruce Brown's buried. Like they just, some of this is a redux on what we did yesterday, but like,
yeah, but the Bruce Brown piece is the perfect example. You already had the sample size, right? We're talking about you got a sample size from these two rookies. How do you not know?
Millsap too. I get that he sucked, whatever, but like, even you would never have known if he sucked early in the season because they just didn't do anything consistently with him at all. Right. And so it's, we finally figured it out. Right. But it took way longer to figure out than it should have because there was no consistency around the process even early. This is where I do wonder still around some of this like organizational planning around what the minutes are. Now, if everyone's healthy and it looks good and it's just easier to just sort of plan on a game to game basis, I get why that's kind of a problem, has been a problem too. But there are just too many examples of, the plan seems to be like whatever you reached into a bag and pulled out that night. And that's the plan. I don't like, this is, hey, look, your name got pulled. You get to play tonight. Like there's a few too many examples that along those lines around with the Nets. Maybe some of it's just the herky jerky nature of all the crap that's happened for them over the last couple of years. But I haven't seen a lot of examples, even when it's been good, about like it being consistent around that. So anyway, I hope it changes here.
We're going to talk more about, because we'll get out of here on this. We're going to talk more about other David Duke Jr. We'll get to him, some guys down in the G League potentially, just again, fleshing out this roster in the course of the offseason. But because Kessler Edwards and Cam Thomas are the two highest profile guys and the ones we think can have real contributing roles here. You mentioned about the value. You need guys that are younger and on cheaper contracts to contribute. Is there any world that in over the course of this offseason, Cam Thomas or Kessler Edwards is a part of some process to acquire something different? Another player that comes in to fill out this roster in a different way. I tend to think that the Kessler Edwards, they need more of that version, as we said on this episode. But I want to tie it in with Cam Thomas. He's a scorer, and scoring's great. But do the Nets need more of that with everything that they have right now? Do you see any world where they organizationally make the right or wrong choice, sacrificing youth and talent to try to achieve that short-term goal?
I need to look up if they commit to this team option, they might have a window where they can't trade him. So I'll look. I'll pause on that one because I'm not positive. I just don't think you're at a timeline piece where you really should be doing that right now. I think that these guys aren't important enough to you organizationally that you should be shipping them off. They're definitely not going to be important enough to some other organization. I don't think so. I think here you just have to just keep it. And it's like I said, at some point you just need to have guys on the books under these that you control the rights on, that you can just not have to pay too much. They can maybe play a little over their thing. They haven't really gotten, I take it back. For years, they got lots of that, right? Like Joe Harris's of the world and stuff like that. But they haven't been getting it recently, and that's been the problem. So I think these guys are almost like, if I had a bet on, I would put these guys 100% on the Nets for next year.
I would think so. And again, to your point, right? Like the example would be Jared Allen. But at some point, you need to develop the young talent and then find a way to stay committed.
Yeah, LeVert, like they did this. Right. I mean, even like they probably sold a little high on LeVert, so that's fine. But like they had those guys for a while, right? They had guys, even Russell to some degree, D'Lo. Like these guys all ended up. Bruce Brown, a lot. There's a million examples. For years they had a million examples of these guys where they just got them off, like the relative scrap heap for what they were, and then turned them into assets that were worth way more. Yeah. That has not happened over the last couple of years. Like that those guys, I mean, I guess, man, I take it back. Maybe Bruce Brown and Cloud. I'm going all over the place. Okay. We're going to get out of here. All right. Yeah. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Nets YouTube channel. Also go and subscribe to One Giant Podcast too. Adam's not going to brag about that. One Giant Podcast just crested over 1,000 YouTube subscribers. That is he and his boy Andy Mack. Go and check those guys out. Those guys are absolutely killing it. I know he's not going to tell you to do it. I just will. Go to subscribe to the One Giant Podcast, and then right after that, go subscribe to the Locked On Nets podcast.
Appreciate it as always. God, what a confidant this man is. By the way, though, friends, availability is important to our quest for success, but dependability is critical. Zig Ziglar.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.